Hi everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for attending this symposium. My name is Nili, and the title of my presentation is Different Levels of Inference about Pairwise Regional Interactions. So different brain regions do not work in isolation, and often multiple brain areas are involved in different tasks. So we'd be interested in quantifying the functional interaction among regions. In this talk, I'll focus on studying the functional connectivity between pairs of regions. So consider the case where we have two regions of interest, let's say ROI1 and ROI2. And the classic way to do this would be to average time courses across different voxels or vertices or neurons in each region, and then compute the correlation coefficient between the two time courses. This requires reducing the dimensionality of brain responses to 1, and in cases where regions are not homogeneous, it could distort the estimates. So here's the depiction of the univariate functional connectivity approach. On the left, you can see that we have the activity patterns elicited for different conditions, condition 1 to condition n in ROI1. And on the right, you can see that we have the activity patterns for the same conditions in another region, let's say ROI2. Now, what the univariate functional connectivity approach does is that it first pulls across all response channels so as to obtain one number per condition. So you can see that we obtain from the rich activity patterns elicited for each condition, we obtain one number which ends up in a vector of n conditions, in a vector that has n condition numbers, and we call it a 1D activation summary for region 1 and a 1D activation summary for region 2. Now we could correlate these two vectors to see how similar they are, and this would be the classic univariate functional connectivity approach. Now, the scope of inference here would be co-activation, and what it would tell us is whether for conditions in which we have a high activation in ROI1, we have also high activation in ROI2, and vice versa. Now, with MBPA, we can probe the information content of brain representations. And one main variant of MBPA is representational similarity analysis, or RSA. So in a summary, in RSA, we compare the activity patterns elicited by stimuli for all pairs of conditions and compute their dissimilarities and put them in a representational dissimilarity matrix, which is shown on the right. And the idea is that this RDM, this matrix, is a characterization of the information content of this region as far as the stimuli are concerned. And interestingly, we can use this approach to test for functional connectivity. So here's the depiction of that. So the way it works is that we compute an RDM for region 1 based on the activity patterns for the n conditions. We can obtain an n by n matrix in which we have the dissimilarities for all pairwise comparisons. And we can also compute an RDM for region 2, and then we can see how similar they are. So if they are similar, we can infer that there is shared information in the two regions. Now, one interesting point about RSA is that RDMs could be derived from second moment matrices. Now consider a stimulus response matrix U, which has in its rows the experimental conditions, or let's say stimuli, and in the columns the response channels, or for example voxels in the case of fMRI. And a second moment matrix would be U times U transpose, which is a condition by condition matrix. Now this matrix has along its diagonals the norm of the activations for each condition. And so this is basically pulled across the voxels. You square them and add them up. And in the off diagonals, we have the inner product between activity patterns for pairs of conditions. So we're comparing pairs of conditions. And these elements could all be, and the elements that are used in RSA could all be derived from second moment matrices. So, so we can consider this U times U transpose as the generative matrix that could lead us to different matrices that we would then use for RSA. Now, now we know from mathematics that these matrices, the second moment matrices, which are all PSD matrices, or reside on a manifold which is called the Riemannian manifold. Therefore, the Riemannian geometry would be the right mathematical tool for comparing representations in RSA. And we've recently shown that there are many advantages for this geometry-aware approach. So one main advantage is good sensitivity to capture nonlinear regional interactions. So we've used simulations in which two regions have a nonlinear relationship and considered all methods that are known to be sensitive. So we compared them to the distance on the Riemannian manifold. And the simulations work like this. So we have one region, ROI1, and the activity patterns for each run are XR, for example. And then we apply a multivariate linear transformation and a nonlinearity on top of that to obtain the activity pattern for each run in region 2. And then we apply all these different methods and see how well they do and compare them to the distance on the Riemannian manifold. So in panel A, you can see the performance of distance correlation. In panel B, you can see the correlation of RDMs, like the classic RSA approach. And in panel C, you can see the distance on the Riemannian manifold. And in panel D, you can see the centered kernel alignment, which is a relatively new method introduced by Jeff Hinton's lab. So, and we consider a range of parameters here. So we see how well they do for different numbers of voxels and the ratio of number of conditions to number of voxels. And we saw that among all of these methods, the distance on the Riemannian manifold has the highest sensitivity. So I must add that what I'm showing you here is a z-stat across subjects for each method. And basically, the whiter a method or the more significant ones we have for a method, the more sensitive it is. And we can see that the Riemannian distance gives us the highest among all these. And is nicely sort of sensitive to these nonlinear relationships. So now note that the diagonals in a second moment matrix are the norm of the activations, as I said before. So as we use the Riemannian distance of the second moment matrices, we're sensitive to both univariate and multivariate relationships. And here we show that this is a combined measure which tests for sensitivity for both and is sensitive to both univariate and multivariate relationships. So it's a combined test. It doesn't treat the univariate and the multivariate differently. It can benefit from both similarities in terms of the overall average response and also the shared information in the fine-grained activity patterns. And we call that a model-free representational connectivity analysis because there are no models involved here. So this is sensitive to similarities among all pairwise distinctions, but it is ambiguous about the content of the shared information. So, all this tells us is that whether two regions have shared information or not, it doesn't tell us which aspects are shared. And so historically, the first attempt to test for shared information is Mark Coutance's informational connectivity. And in that, they obtain time courses of classification accuracy or confidence or classification confidence for a pair of stimuli, in this case, scissors and shoes, and then compare the time courses across regions. So they obtain one time course of classification accuracy from the multivariate patterns for region 1, another one for region 2, and then they see how similar they are. Now, one can think of expanding this to compute one RDM for each time point, and then compute time courses of correlations to say a model RDM, and then see how similar the two time courses are. So this would be a natural extension of information connectivity, and it tests for connectivity with respect to a specific model. And in fact, this could be, as we argue in a paper, this could be a caveat of this because it tests connectivity through the lens of a particular model, so it could give us a narrow perspective. And then there are different implementations for it. So the idea here is that we obtain one RDM for region 1, one RDM for region 2, and then we compare the RDMs, for example, over time with the same model RDM in each region, and then we have these time courses of correlations, and then we see the similarity of these time courses. And so what this tells us, the inference scope would be shared information about a specific aspect of task which was specified by the model. Now note that we have only one model here, so we have a shared model between the two regions. Now we can also have one model per region and see if the time courses of correlations to models in one region reliably precedes another one. So what this would tell us, so for example, we have V1 and we have IT cortex. We have one model RDM for V1, another model RDM for IT. We compute correlations over time for this region, compute correlations over time for the IT region, and we see if the correlation of V1 to its model RDM reliably precedes the correlation of the IT to its own model RDM. So what this would suggest is that it would suggest that information is transformed from one type to another. And what you can see here is that, so what this approach does, just to recap it again, we have the neural RDM for region 1, and we have an ROI1 model. So we have a specific model for region 1. And we compute the correlation of this of the neural RDM from region 1 to its model RDM, ROI1 model. And we have the neural RDM for region 2, and we have an ROI2 model as well. So we have these 2 time courses of correlations, which are obtained from the neural RDM of each region, that is being compared to its own model RDM. And now that we have these 2 time courses, we could see with basically whether one is consistently appears later or after or earlier than the other one. And in that case, it would suggest that information is being transferred from one type in region 1 to another type in region 2, or from one type in the region that it appears earlier to another time in a different region in which it appears later. So as I told you here, the different inference scopes, there are different inference scopes that could be afforded by different methods. We could test for co-activation, we could test with the univariate approach, we could test for shared information with multivariate approaches, and we could use the model-free RCA with that, which is just testing for shared information. And as I said, the Riemannian geometry with the distance on the Riemannian manifold, which comes from the Riemannian geometry, would give us the highest sensitivity for a model-free RCA, and it would capture both univariate and multivariate commonalities in 2 regions. And then we could have models in testing for connectivity, and we could have one model for the 2 regions, and that could shed light on the content of shared information. And we could have one model per region and not a common model, one model per region, and that could capture transformation of information across regions. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge all my collaborators. So this paper, which was a review paper, we wrote with Alessio Basti and Olaf Hoek and Laura Marzetti and Richard Rickenson. And this other paper, which introduced the distance on the Riemannian manifold, was done by Kadigli Niran, Mahdiyar Shahbazi, Ali Shiradi, and Hamid Aghajan were the other co-authors. And this is the latest piece that we wrote with Hamid Karimi and Alex Woolgar and Rick Henson about the different ways to do model-based representational connectivity analysis. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to my presentation.